Okay, I just wanted to do another sequencer sandbox or sequence sandbox video to explain at a very high level what it does. If people are interested, I'd be happy to demo the tool. There is a no talk demo video that I already have out there. So if you just want to see it in action, that's probably the best way to see it in action. In this case, I just want to point out the various elements and what they functionally do. So it should be a very, very quick video. Um, it's probably worth pointing out at the outset that there was basically no reasoning or purpose behind building this. It was inspired by a Mylar Melodies video that he did where he's using a Turing machine to modulate the hits of a Euclidean sequencer that is then that results in a dynamic bass line that can then be managed very easily during a performance. Okay, and so let me just point out the different pieces. So um, here's the Turing machine, and you can select whether you want to use the Turing machine to modulate the Euclidean sequencer or the Binet, which is this guy right here, to modulate the Euclidean sequencer. Um, the You can also choose which clock to use. So, for example, if you use the Euclidean clock or the clock from the Euclidean sequencer, what you'll do is the Turing machine will receive another clock pulse at the end of a full pattern, Euclidean sequencer pattern. If you choose the master clock, the Turing machine will generate a new note every clock pulse. So it's just a different algorithm producing similar results, but will be different, a different way to achieve a similar kind of result. But it'll vary because of the timing of things. Um, you can you can with the Binet, you can choose to um, make it manual, which means that instead of uh, the clock uh, advancing the notes or the quote notes, essentially the voltage values here, just like from the Turing machine, the voltage values that are going to um, modulate the hits in the Euclidean sequencer. You can stop that and by clicking this button, and then I can change the voltages manually just by changing whatever dial is lit up that's active, or by using these pads. Um, there is a we'll get to that light in a second. These are just labels on the mixer telling you what's using the macro oscillator and what's using the resonator, so that if you want to solo or mute one or the other voices, so there are two voices that are supported with this patch, and you can swap. This button right here will allow. This is the global reset here, and then this button here will swap the voices. So if you want the Euclidean sequencer to, which is the default, if you want the Euclidean sequencer to control the bass line, and um, that would be the macro oscillator, um, then then you wouldn't have to do anything because that's the default. And you can see here I'm using this switch really just as a light. I'm going external into here. And this light means that the Euclidean sequence is controlling the baseline. If you click this swap button here, that light will go out. It's just a reminder of which voice you're controlling with the Euclidean sequencer. Down here, we have the pattern length. So you can, this is just going off the screen a little bit just because I wanted to fit all the interactions. But This tells you what's going on with your pattern. Your length you can set with this knob here. We have the source of notes. So up here, this is the source of the Euclidean. This is what's driving, modulating the Euclidean sequencer hits, and what clock's being used for that purpose for the Turing machine. But down here, it's the note source. So where do you want that? Where's the note sequence being stored? So it could be here in the Binet, or it could be in this grid sequencer. I'm going to get to these other grid sequencers in a minute, but this grid sequencer here is designed to be able to be controlled by the Euclidean sequencer. And so you can use the Binet or you can use the grid sequencer. There are reasons why each is interesting to use. There's some differences in how they function. But I won't go into that unless people want me to do a more detailed video. I'll be happy to do it, but I don't want to bore people either. But this is what picks the note source. And then there is the advance method. So it's how do you advance the note in the sequence. You can advance a note from the Euclidean sequencer, or you can advance a note from the master clock. If you advance a note from the Euclidean sequencer, and for example, the sequencer, well, you can see, we can use this as an example. This sequencer has, looks like step 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, and let's just say 8 or something, 1, 5, and 1, 5, and 8 or something like that. If you're using the sequencer to advance the notes in the sequence, you're going to be playing the first 3 notes of the sequence, because you'll advance for this note or this step, and you advance for this step, and advance for whatever, the 7th or the 8th step. If you use the master clock, you'll be advancing the note in the sequence every clock pulse, which means that in this case you'll play the first note, and then the 5th note, and then the 8th note. So it's a difference in how that works. With the so if you select the grid sequencer that you want to use, if you select that you want to use the grid sequencer, and you have the Euclidean sequencer it doesn't matter whether you do the grid sequencer or the Euclidean sequencer or the clock, but you have the grid sequencer for your note source, then you'll just use the grid sequencer here. Now you can decouple this grid sequencer from the Euclidean sequencer. And you do that by, the first thing you would want to do is to use the master clock as a source. And then here you can say stop the Euclidean reset. So there's the Euclidean sequencer will reset each of these sequences. Like, for example, if the length is 8, then it will reset. You want it to reset this grid or this matrix back to the first note after those 8 steps. So you want to turn that off if you want to decouple this grid sequencer from the Euclidean sequencer. There's some pretty cool combinations that can happen, though. If you want to do that, is you can leave the reset from the Euclidean sequencer, and you can use the Euclidean sequencer reset to control how many notes you want in your grid sequencer, even when you're decoupling it, so that the only thing that the Euclidean sequencer does is set the number of steps for this grid sequencer. The other thing you can do is, when you're in the normal mode, you can randomize these gates. So by default, these gates, you can see that the way this is saved, that they're not all lit up. But by default, you'll want the gates, to initialize this. In fact, I'll just do that now. I can initialize this so that way I won't have to remember. I'll save this as, so if you initialize this, then let's randomize these notes. Um, every 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 gate that the Euclidean sequencer sends, you'll get a note, just like you would over here for the Binet. The Binet doesn't generate um, gates or anything. It's just a straight sequencer. But if you did want to randomize the gates, then what you would end up with is the intersection of the grid sequencer gates and the Euclidean sequencer gates. And so you'd have to have that intersection in order to play a note. And so you can kind of get some interesting blends of the Euclidean sequencer gates and the grid sequencer randomized gates. And you might get a pretty cool groove that way. And so that's what this does here, is you can say that I still want the Euclidean gates, or I want just the grid sequencer gates. And so if you use the master clock, you have grid sequencer selected here, you use the master clock, you stop the Euclidean reset, and you choose the grid sequencer as your gate. Then what you've done is you have completely just turned off the rest. You've separated this sequencer from the rest of the machine. And then that's where we start getting into these sequences down here. Another feature that you have with this sequencer is that you can have, once it's decoupled, you can have it be randomizing the notes and the gates every. I think I have it. Well, you can actually control that as well. Over here, there's a label here. Green equals the modulator steps. So you can control the number of steps in a sequence. And so what happens is that based on the number of steps in a sequence, these randomized CV inputs will fire. So essentially what it means is that, and by default, you have 16 steps for this. And so what happens is that every 16 steps, these will be randomized. So what it ends up being is like a kind of like the Turing machine, where it's going to keep randomizing until you want it to stop randomizing. So when you hear something you like, or you think you might like, you can make this red, click this, and it'll stop that automatic randomization. That's different. So that's more like the Turing machine than the Binet and then these other sequences down here. So see the Binet, if you want to randomize it, you'd have to manually randomize it. So whenever you want to randomize it, you just use the VCVRAC randomize function that works with any module, right? Same thing with, if you want to randomize this sequence up here, you can request it to randomize. Whereas the Turing machine, you decide when to stop it from randomizing, or you can lock it in and decide to randomize it some more. Now, I'll talk about the second set of 32 steps as well, because it operates on demand with randomizing too. But back to this Euclidean, the grid sequence that you're creating, once you decouple it from the Euclidean sequencer. And you don't have to decouple it from the Euclidean sequencer, but if you do, then what you can do is you can also create a 16-step sequence or a 32-step sequence. And that's what this switch does right here, is you can choose 16 or 32 steps. And so if you do 32 steps, then you'll have these two go together. You can have a 32-step sequence, and then the randomization affects both of them. So it will randomize both of these, all 32 steps. Or you can just have the 16 steps if you want. Now, the when you stop the randomization, you can also manually randomize. So if you like the way that one sounds but not the other, you can stop it and then just randomize one or the other and so forth. The same 16 or 32 steps decision can be made for these two sequencers. And these two sequencers uh, are always non-binded. They're not bound to at all to the Euclidean sequencer side. So, but they are bound to the second voice. So if you if you if you decouple this sequence from the Euclidean sequencer, you're still using the same voice of the Euclidean sequencer. So, for example, by default, you'd be using the macro oscillator, and these would be creating the baseline. These two here, either 16 or 32 note sequences, are using the other voice. So if you swap the voices, you can have these control the bass line, but by default, they're going to be controlling the melody. And they function just like these two, except that there's a button up here. You see sequence number 2. When you click this button, it will randomize these. So it's a randomization on demand, sort of like the binays are, right? And that's it. I have everything on the screen, so you don't have to worry about this stuff. There's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of guts and logic over here, but you don't need to worry about that. So that's why I moved. I would never develop this like this, but once I developed it and I wanted to see if I could get everything together, uh, I was able. It was pretty cool that I was able to get almost everything on 3 rows and one column or whatever, one screen. The only other thing I think, yeah, with the exception of just over here, this one guy right here didn't fit on the screen. I could probably get him to fit on the screen now that I think about it. I could probably pull him over here so at least you can scroll down and not have to come back up. So I could pull him. Um, yeah, this is probably a good idea. Let me put him over here so he doesn't confuse anyone, like here. So now you don't have to scroll over there anymore. Now you can see him. So you got 3 rows and everything that you need. Okay, I hope that's interesting. Again, there's um, the no talk demo of this, and if somebody wants me to go through and talk about the menus and how, demonstrate specifically how everything I just said affects everything, I'd be happy to do that. And if anybody wants me to do a technical, uh, in-depth explanation of how all of this works, I'd be happy to do that as well. But I normally don't do that kind of thing until at least one person is interested in it. So anyway, thanks for watching.